Let's talk about the philosophy and values of the Victorians. Here is a quick chart that you can use for reference that just gives a basic overview of the philosophy and values that we find in the Victorian era. Not all of these rows or columns and rows align with the same idea. It's just a chart. So um, we're going to talk about the values, major ideas, literary forms and structures, the themes, genres and styles, and some key authors. And we've read some of these, and then we're going to read even more from these authors. And so let's talk about values. This column is highlighted because this is kind of the most important thing. If you remember this column, you can remember these other ideas that we're going to talk about. These are some of the values that the Victorians held dear, and these changed throughout this whole era because so much was happening in Britain during this time and in America, but in Britain especially because of reform movements and just different rights of different types of people in society. Ideas were spreading in a completely new way. And so sometimes these values apply and sometimes they don't. It depends on what author you're reading about. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But some of the main values were earnestness, which is a characteristic that comes from a sincere conviction. So people were convicted about certain things. Respectability, what it meant to be a lady and a gentleman, for instance. What it meant to be someone in the upper class or the lower class. What it meant to be the the heir of an estate or a servant in an estate. So this idea of respectability, what it meant to have honor, was a value during this time. Evangelism. This one sounds kind of weird to be included here, but the evangelical movement was growing during this time in Britain, and this had a timely correspondence with Britain's expansion in the world as well, and colonialism, and the whole idea of spreading the Christian gospel. And not everyone in this era was an evangelical. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Evolution and progress. We start hearing more about this um, Darwinian evolution, even social Darwinism. Hypocrisy, what people say versus what they do. I don't know why this is necessarily a value, but it's kind of a big, almost thematic element throughout. But it's in this values column. So what is said versus what is actually done, and we're going to talk about a few pieces where hypocrisy is an idea that is explored. The Protestant work ethic. This is a phrase you've probably heard in your other classes. Restraint, how much to say and do versus what you don't say and do. So this idea of restraint. The Victorians were very proper at times, and sometimes we as postmodernists read these Victorian pieces and wonder why didn't that character say something, or why weren't they honest about what they thought? Why didn't they change? Well, there's this value of restraint to a Victorian. Utilitarianism. We'll talk more about that at the end, but utilitarianism was a completely new social idea during this time. And it ties into this last one, a strong emphasis on duty. Some major ideas from this era were the expansion of the empire, and that ties into evangelism and just other ideas, how transportation made expansion even more feasible. The glorification of war. We know that there were revolutions and reforms and wars during this time that we see a lot in art and in literature. Industrialism, again, the industrialized nation of Britain was, this was a completely new era because of the Industrial Revolution. And because of that, there was a lot of economic prosperity. People were making goods. They were becoming more efficient in work. Factories and workhouses became a norm. And because of that, we have the next one, reform. Because of all this newness of technology and how goods were being processed, people didn't really think about what effects that had on on the people that worked in those areas. So we'll talk more about child labor law reform and women's rights reform and things like that. The literary forms and structures. Usually in this era, we see a narrative over lyric, meter and rhythm over imagery. So we'll see a lot of meaning in the meter and rhythm. That's what that means. Literature was objective and reflective, um, melancholy and meditative. Even in love poems, there was this idea of melancholy in them. Moral issues were a primary form in literature of all types. What is moral and what is right? How can people be the judge of what is right in this type of social climate? And didactic means it something that teaches you something that a lesson can be learned from. Contemporary subjects. All that means is these people were writing about the same people of their time period. Usually, I mean, of course, there were pieces of literature that referenced older time periods, but mostly it was addressing their contemporaries, people in their own era. These works were long, especially a lot of the lyric pieces that we read are pretty long over the shorter forms that we've seen in the Romantic era. And a lot of times there are medieval subjects and forms that are represented in the literature. A lot of the themes revolve around isolation and alienation. A lot of poets at this time isolated themselves because they didn't feel understood, especially at the end of the Victorian era. We'll see a lot of that. There's a lack of communication. That's kind of a theme that's present. And that ties into this melancholy or meditative, even in love poems. A lot of pieces are about, two lovers who maybe they didn't say the right thing, or the timing wasn't right in their relationship or something like that, and it wasn't communicated well, and the consequences of that, pessimism and despair, kind of makes a comeback in the Victorian literature. A loss of faith is also another idea that ties into evangelism. Christian writers were talking about, with all of the industrialization of our time and these new ideas like social Darwinism and evolution, and these ideas make this Christian religion that Britain has experienced and has held on to for years. It made people question their faith. Also, just with reform movements and revolutions that have happened before, people were really questioning what they believed. And didactic is there again. And some of the genres and styles: dramatic monologue, novel, elegies, and magazines. A lot of time pamphlets are in this category. These poets wrote and they would submit their poems to a magazine or a pamphlet, and people would critique them. And so these Victorian poets had a lot of criticism coming at them, but it was a way for them to get published and get their ideas out there more consistently, and they didn't have to write a complete work and then get that published. And this was especially a great inroad for the female writers of the time. Not just poets, but novelists would write sections of their novels and submit them to a magazine. So, every month or every quarter, whenever the magazine would come out, there'd be a new chapter from one of these novels that these women wrote, even though they were writing under pen names. This was a way for women to actually earn an income because these magazines were paying them. And so, of course, that ties into these new ideas of the Victorian woman, and should they be able to work and use this art form of literature that was always in the men's domain to make a living. It brought up a lot of questions during this time. So it is here with respectability, this value of respectability. Is it respectable for an upper class woman to submit a novel for a magazine? Brought up a lot of questions. In the drama realm, we see a lot of comedy of manners, and we'll read one in class. Rigid standards of personal behavior, that again ties into a lot of these values. And there was a high moral tone. Again, the Victorian era really did focus on morality and ethics and things like that. And some key authors: Lord Tennyson, classic Victorian example of a author. Sorry. of an author. He's a great poet, and we'll read some of his stuff in class. The Brontes, as you know, Oscar Wilde, one of my favorites. He kind of came at the end of the Victorian era and challenged a lot of what Victorians thought about things. And once we talk more about Oscar Wilde, you'll understand why he was such a controversial author during this time. Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning, Charles Dickens, Thomas Carlyle, Matthew Arnold. He was actually an anti-evangelical. He kind of walked away from Christianity and became an agnostic, and a lot of his pieces were about that transition and what does it mean to be a Christian evangelical. Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Christina Rossetti, their brother and sister, amazing poets. Dante was a poet and a really great painter, and so they wrote a lot of things about art and things like that. And Rudyard Kipling, of course. Okay, here's the second page. Just a really quick rundown of the Victorian era versus the Romantic era that came before it. So, in the realm of idealism, nature, focus, and philosophy, here are some differences we see between these two eras. And this is a very brief overview for you. So, the Romantics were visionaries. They believed in a utopian existence, they thought that that was possible. But then in the Victorian era, the Victorians were more sober minded and they became utilitarian. They became a utilitarian society. So, when it comes to nature, we know that the Romantics thought that nature was kind and harmonious. And then the Gothic writers believed that nature could be healing and destructive at the same time. The Victorian era saw nature as harsh and cruel. You'll see that in a lot of works. The focus of the Romantic era was on the individual, that inward, that looking inward, introspective stance of the author, common man, imagination, introspection. But the Victorians came along and they had new problems. Okay, so they weren't focused as much on themselves. The artists weren't. They were focused on what was happening in their nation. They were focusing on this middle class that was up and coming. What do we do with these people? How do they fit into what we have always had as a structure in our culture? So these artists were focused on these people. Reality, what is real, what is useful, and work. The philosophy of the Romantics was transcendental. Transcendentalism is basically an idea that what we know about ourselves, this knowledge that we have about ourselves, it doesn't just come from what we've been told. It comes from beyond what we can see and smell and taste and touch. It transcends all those things. And this isn't really a religious idea of transcendentalism. It's just a way that people learned how to navigate their relationships. That's transcendentalism in a nutshell. And then on the opposite side, we have utilitarianists. The Victorians were utilitarian in their thinking. And a lot of these philosophies stemmed out of the Enlightenment philosophes, those French philosophes. And so we'll talk more about utilitarianism later in class. And just to wrap up, where it says more Victorian, a key metaphor of the Victorians is struggle or strife. The key themes of literature, this theory of evolution that we talked about earlier, this Darwinian ideas, they lead to a crisis of the faith. How do these ideas fit into what I know as a Christian? There was intellectual and spiritual doubt, and the antidote to that was work. So the Victorians worked, and this is seen in the Industrial Society, and et cetera, et cetera. There was a growing social consciousness, so several reform movements were happening during this time. Child labor, safety laws, and hours worked. Those were ideas that nobody had any idea about, and they didn't have a framework for, well, we're making children work in factories and workhouses. Is that even ethical? Remember, we're talking about the Victorian society, this moral society. And now because of this industrialization that's happening, we have to put people to work. A lot of times it was poor children. They're this lower class would send their kids to work in and these factories and workhouses, and children would die because of there were no laws governing the type of equipment that was used. There weren't any rules like we have today. There weren't safety precautions in place. They would work 18, 19 hours a day sometimes. And so these reform movements started happening during this time. The Victorians were starting to realize, okay, we have to do something to give rights back to these people because they're children. And it's interesting, out of this era, especially at the end, we start inventing this idea of the adolescent. We didn't have adolescents. We just had children and adults. And then because children were going to work and going to school started becoming mandatory, this idea of the adolescent emerged out of the Victorian and the modern, at the beginning of the modern era. It's really interesting. And then again, social consciousness with women. This was kind of a springboard for the early 1900s suffrage movements in America and things like that. But in Britain especially, women were demanding emancipation. They wanted to work. They wanted to be able to make their own living. They wanted to be free from the house. The traditional Victorian society was really fascinated with the idea of the Victorian woman at home, that domestic life at home. But in reality, women wanted their emancipation. They wanted to be able to work and make their own decisions and things like that. They wanted rights to their family's money. They wanted enfranchisement. They wanted to be able to vote and have those rights. And this new woman, this evolution of the woman, started during this time. And in the early 1920s, we see a major shift in thinking, sometimes even jumping into the other ditch about how women, who they really were. So there was this like strange evolution of what a woman was during the Victorian British era. And this idea of the Victorian Trinity of religion, science, and morality, all that really means is the balance between those three things was apparent during this time. And this is just a thematic idea. So a lot of works that you'll read or art that you see, even the music from the Victorian era, kind of reflects this idea, that trinity, religion versus science versus what's actually moral, and where do we get morals from? Is it from science? Is it from religion? So those are some ideas to think about. There was an idea of British nationalism because Britain was the first great industrialized nation. Think about that, how that transformed the landscape of this country, this tiny island. And now Britain was expanding all across the world. And so it was kind of amazing to be be British, I guess you could say. And then lastly, and I said this before, poetry was just really rich and grew into some. This was a catalyst for what poetry became after that. And these poets felt alienated, betrayed, estranged from life and love, and they would isolate themselves from others. They would isolate themselves from their friends and family. And Oscar Wilde's a prime example of this, and a lot of others. And this kind of is going to roll over into the early modern era in America, with what we call the lost generation. So I want you to plug that away in your brain, that we're going to talk about the lost generation. I want you to remember that kind of started back here in the Victorian era with these poets who didn't really know where they belonged in this society that was trying to figure out all these economic and social problems and religious problems that they were having. And you had these poets who were trying to write about it, and they were kind of estranged. And so those are some ideas to think about as we go into talking more about Victorian literature.